Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, most gracious, ever merciful. Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings of Allah be upon you, dear viewers. Welcome to tonight's lecture organized by the UK Talim Department. As per our tradition, we will start the program with the recitation of the Holy Quran. Can I request Amir Ahmed Sahib to deliver the tilawat and its English translation, please?
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض ما ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا بما شاء وسع كرسيه السماوات والأرض ولا يؤوده حفظهما وهو العلي العظيم. Translation. In the name of Allah, the Gracious, the Merciful. Allah, there is no God but He, the living, the self-subsisting, and all-sustaining. Slumber sees Him not, nor sleep. To Him belongs whatsoever is in the heaven and whatsoever is in the earth. Who is He that will intercede with Him except by His permission? He knows what is before them and what is behind them, and they encompass nothing of His knowledge except what He pleases. His knowledge extends over the heavens and the earth, and the care of them burdens Him not, and He is the High, the Great. Jazakumullah.
Jazakallah. Tonight we have the pleasure and privilege of being joined by Abdul Ghany Jahangeer Sahib, who's serving as a Murrabi Silsila. He's been missionary for 30 years, specializes in translating Ahmadiyya literature in French. As always, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions to our speaker. Please type those questions in the chat and kindly ensure they are relevant to tonight's topic. It gives me a great pleasure to pass over to Murrabi Sahib to deliver tonight's lecture.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. To all our dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. As you probably know, the topic of tonight's lecture is how do we know God exists? This is arguably the biggest challenge faced by believers in God. The question from those who doubt is, what proof do you have of God's existence? So how do we know God exists? There are masses of evidence for intelligence in the design of living things. And you must have seen loads of YouTube videos, articles, etc., where believers of different faiths, not just Muslims, are in my opinion, totally rational. They're being very rational and reasonable when they present such evidence of intelligent design. For example, we could say that it would be quite irrational to affirm that the meaningful functional information found in the genetic builder's manual, if you can call it that, inside the cells of every living creature, comprising instructions for assembling every body part and generating every function of that organism, could be produced from chaos. That would be a very irrational thing to say. Such information can only come from an exquisitely unique form of intelligence. And the same could be said for the fine-tuning of the universe and the Goldilocks effect, where all the constants of the universe have been set with astonishing precision at the only possible values, and the positioning of the celestial bodies has been perfectly orchestrated for life on Earth to exist. However, as Hadrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the promised Messiah, peace be upon him, and founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, declared in his fantastic lecture, The Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam, all this evidence points to the fact that there ought to be an intelligent, all-powerful creator. This type of evidence, however, does not show that he is still here. The promised Messiah, peace be upon him, posited that reason and therefore science can only take the seeker of truth to the level of overwhelming plausibility. Reason is not able to go any further and prove that God still exists. The promised Messiah, peace be upon him, goes on to say that the only way for us to attain certainty regarding the existence of God, is for God himself to say, I am here. Now, I'd like to draw the attention of our viewers towards two ways that God actually does this. I mean, how he says, I am here to his creatures. The first way is he speaks to his creatures. That is, I'm talking here of the phenomenon of revelation, which in Arabic is called wahy or ilham. And the second way is he intervenes in their lives. Now, one of the major proofs of his existence is the fact that he reveals the future to some of his servants. They, in turn, inform people of what has been predicted by God. And when the prophesied event comes to pass, it becomes potent proof of a living, all-knowing God. One of the reasons the promised Messiah, peace be upon him, was sent in this age was precisely for that. It's an age of atheism, it's an age of disbelief, and the one of the reasons he was sent was to give the world a very large number of experiences of divine revelation. Over the course of the last 140 years, many doubters have believed in God. They began to believe in God after witnessing examples of revelation at play as they were displayed in the Ahmadiyya community. And this phenomenon continues today within our community. Much has been written and said on this topic. Today, I invite everyone to focus on the second way that God shows his existence, and that is his blessed interventionism in our lives. That is to say, how he responds to our prayers and how he changes situations in our favor. In the Holy Quran, Allah declares and I'm going to read first of all chapter 2, verse 186. It says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وإذا سألك عبادي عني فإني قريب أجيب دعوة الداعي إذا دعاني. And likewise in chapter 40, verse 60, he says, وَقَالَ رَبُّكُمْ أُدْعُونِي أَسْتَجِبْ لَكُمْ. And this means that if my servant asks you about me, tell him, I am near. I answer the call of the one who calls upon me, or I answer the prayer of the one who prays to me. And the second verse means, and your Lord said, call upon me, I will respond to you, I will answer you. When asked how he knows God exists, His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, the fifth Caliph of the Ahmadiyya movement, may Allah strengthen his hands, has replied on several occasions that God answers his prayers and the prayers of members of the Ahmadiyya community. Indeed, as someone myself who has had the opportunity to translate Huzur's correspondence with the French-speaking world and also with French speakers living in other countries of the world, I've seen firsthand countless examples of the acceptance of Huzur's prayers, often in astonishing ways. I, like others working in the correspondence department, have seen how God intervenes in the lives of Ahmadis after they have written about their problems to Huzur and have requested him to pray for them. Now, the more stubborn among atheists may object and say, well, why doesn't God always intervene? Why doesn't he prevent believers from ever being harmed? They don't reflect on the fact that in a world where God does not exist, there can be no divine intervention at all. The fact that there are numerous instances of intervention in so many different ways is proof that God exists. As Huzur recently put it, God isn't our slave. He is under no obligation at all to intervene each and every time we desire him to. And when he does, he is not bound to intervene in the way we want him to. The when and the how are his sole prerogative. Over the years, in his sermons and Jalsa speeches, Huzur has presented a very large number of incidents from all corners of the world on how his prayers and the prayers and devotions of Ahmadi Muslims were responded to by God in amazing ways. Often, their problems were solved after Huzur had prayed for them against all expectations and all the odds. And this is also, interestingly, frequently the case with individuals from outside our community who write to Huzur for prayers. They too later write back to tell Huzur how his prayers were miraculously accepted by God and how their difficulties were removed. Now, of course, these sermons and speeches can be found online, and in particular, everyone should listen to Huzur's speech on the second day of our UK Jalsa Salana, that is our international annual conference. Because on that day, usually a Saturday, Huzur presents many examples of God's intervention in the lives of Ahmadis all over the world. So something I would highly recommend. In every Ahmadi family, there have been instances of the acceptance of prayers in astonishing ways, and it's almost impossible to find an Ahmadi who hasn't personally seen or heard of such examples. To illustrate, I will share 3 examples that I know of personally. The first is of a gentleman from Benin who has been living in Germany. I actually made his acquaintance during one of the Jalsa Salanas or annual conferences in Germany during the late 90s. And when I met him, it was the first day of the conference. It was a Friday. And those of you who know will, of course, be aware of the fact that our conferences usually last for 3 days. So it would be the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Now, when I met him, he was quite enthusiastic. He'd been given duties in the French-speaking tent, which was specially allotted for French speakers from around the world attending the conference. But I detected some sadness in him, and I asked him if everything was all right. And he said, yes, everything's fine. But I asked one of his colleagues later on that he doesn't seem, at ease and that maybe there's something that's disturbing him. And he said, well, actually, I know what it is. He said that, as you may know, that was in those days, in the late 90s. I don't know if it's still the case now. But in those days, as an asylum seeker, he would have had to apply for permission to be able to leave his region to enter into another region in Germany from the local Ministry of Asylum in his region. And he said he did go for that, and he submitted the application to one of the clerks in the office there. And the clerk told him, we're very sorry, but we can't give you 3 days. He'd asked for 5. So 1 day to travel to the Jalsa site, 3 days for the Jalsa, and 1 day to go back. He said, we can only give you 2 days. And he said, but I've got duties there for all 3 days, and I need to get there, I need to get back. I have to be there for all 3 days, and I need some time to travel as well. So the clerk, wasn't very cooperative, and said, well, we're very sorry, but you're only going to get 2 days. So anyway, he was quite upset, but he took the 2 days. So that meant that he had to travel on the Friday, get there very early on Friday, and then he'd have to travel back on the Saturday afternoon to be back in time for him to be in full legality. Because if you were caught as an asylum seeker outside the permitted hours in another region, then there would be severe repercussions. So that's why he was upset, and rightly so. So anyway, I went and I told him. I said, I've heard of your predicament, and he said, please pray for me. And he said he'd written to Huzur as well for prayers, and informed him of the situation. So he'd sent in a letter on the first day of the Jalsa. So anyway, on the Saturday morning, late morning, I met him again. The Friday went well. Then on Saturday morning, almost at around midday, I met him, and he was absolutely bubbling with joy. And I said, well, you're in a good mood, so has there been any good news or something? And he said, well, actually, yes, there's been very good news. He said, this morning, I noticed that there were some guests who were being given a guided tour of the Jalsa site. Some of them were dressed very nicely in nice suits, etc. And I thought they must be quite important personalities. So he said, I thought I'd just do my civic duty and go and welcome them and say hello to them. They were, of course, with somebody else who was giving them a guided tour, but he walked up to them and said hello, nicely to them and welcomed them. And he said one of the gentlemen, who appeared to be somebody quite important, asked him, so who are you and where do you live? So he said, well, I'm this person and I live in this place. And he said, so you're here for the whole conference, are you? And he said, I told him, well, actually, I'm not. I'm going to have to go back today. And the gentleman said, but why? Why is that? So he said, well, he told him the story of how he'd been to the Ministry of Asylum in his region and how the clerk had refused to give him the all 5 days. And he'd given him only 2. So basically, he really needed 3, but he'd asked for 5. Anyway, he got 2, as I'd said. So the gentleman said, oh, really? Is that so? So he said, he started opening his briefcase, and he said, and what's your good name again? So he told him his name, and he said, how do you spell that? So he started writing something on some paper. And he said, and you do live in this place, do you? And he said, yes. And so then he signed the paper and took out a stamp from his case, and he stamped the paper. And he handed it to him, and he said, here's your permission to stay for all 3 days of the conference. He said, I'm the Minister of Asylum of your region. And the man said, can you believe it? I had been to the ministry, and the clerk had refused to give me my 3 days. And God then, after Huzur prayed for me, God brought the Minister of Asylum himself to meet me. And he gave me my permission, which I couldn't get from his office. So that was a very big sign, and many people who were visiting that day, when they heard about that, non-Ahmadis were there, they were absolutely blown over by what had happened, and it made them be even more interested in finding out about the Ahmadiyya community and our relationship with Allah, with God. So that was the first example. Now, the second example, which I'd like to quote, of God's interventionism, how he intervenes in people's lives, accepts their prayers, and shows them signs, is it's the account of the conversion of a good friend of mine called Mr. Luc Marty, whose Muslim name is Navid, so he's Navid Marty, whom I met in the first time in 1990 in France, and that was the beginning of a very long friendship, which is still ongoing today. I wanted to read out his account in his own words. Now, you might be able to find this online, but I think it's a very interesting case of a person who came from an agnostic background, who was very nominally Christian, and how he actually became a Muslim and how he joined the Ahmadiyya community. So what I'm going to be saying now is in his own words. So this is what he says. My name is Navid Ahmed Marty, and in the following lines I will try to describe the main events which, by the grace of Allah, led me to convert to Islam. I pray to Allah, who has guided me to the truth, that he may allow me to express what is in my heart in the best possible way. So he says, I graduated in 1986, and at the time in France, compulsory military service was in place. With an engineering degree, however, it was possible instead to perform civil service abroad. By chance, I went to the United States and worked for 18 months as a research assistant at the University of Kansas. Arriving there, I met an Algerian student called Sahib. Being able to speak French with him was a big help. He befriended me, and his help was very precious to enable me to settle in this new place. Our relationship was very amicable. I understood rapidly that he was a devoted Muslim, while I was raised in a Catholic family but not practicing. We both had a keen interest in football, so he invited me to join in the games played by a group of students. One afternoon, during a game, we were playing in opposite teams, and he tried to dribble past me. I tried to stop him, and he fell over, although I barely touched him. He was lying on the ground and could not get up. I thought he was pretending in order to get a penalty. He was taken to hospital, and I was told that his ankle was broken. After a few hours, I brought him back home. I felt very bad, and he was stuck in bed for several weeks. I was feeling quite guilty about it, so I started to visit him every other day to offer my services and to keep him company. His favorite topic of discussion was Islam. I was not really interested in this, but I knew that this was making him feel much better. I was surprised by his love and admiration for the Prophet of Islam, and the description he gave me of his character was very different from the image I had. After his complete recovery, I would visit him regularly and particularly liked discussing with him the relation between science and religion. He offered me a Quran with an English translation, and as soon as I started reading it, I was fascinated by its wisdom and the absence of discrepancy with science. I couldn't really find any contradiction with human nature either. One day I came across these verses. And when Allah will say, O Jesus, son of Mary, didst thou say to men, take me and my mother for two gods beside Allah? He will answer, holy art thou. I could never say that to which I had no right. If I had said it, thou wouldst have surely known it. Thou knowest what is in my mind, and I know not what is in thy mind. It is only thou alone who art the knower of hidden things. I said nothing to them except that which thou didst command me. Worship Allah, my Lord and your Lord. And I was witness over them as long as I remained among them. But since thou didst cause me to die, thou hast been the watcher over them, and thou art witness over all things. And that's from chapter 5, and it's verses 117 and 118. So Naveed says that this gave me a terrible shock. Tears came to my eyes. Suddenly, 2,000 years of Christian teaching crumbled in front of my eyes. Even without being able to read Arabic, the translation of the Holy Quran was so beautiful and clear that I was convinced that no human being would have been able to produce it. I knew at that moment that I would have to become a Muslim, although after consideration I decided to wait, as I thought it would be too difficult to give up my habits and change my life. Therefore, I decided to wait until I became 50 or 60 years old. At that age, I thought that I would probably be strong enough not to worry about what people would think. I worried about what would happen if I were to die before converting, but quickly dismissed the idea, quite certain that God would give me enough time. I also started to pray once or twice a day. I didn't know how to do it, so I just prostrated on the floor like I had seen Muslims do. I didn't really know what to expect, and was quite surprised that my prayers were being answered and I was finding comfort and help. My research project finished, I returned to France and started my first job. After a few months, I realized that it was not what I was looking for. I took a few days off and went to The Hague in Holland to interview with an oil company. I wanted the job very much. Unfortunately, I was going through a difficult period, feeling depressed and tired. The interview didn't go well. That evening, back at the hotel, I prayed and asked Allah to give me this job. And in exchange, I would not wait until I was older to convert, and I would do it immediately. 4 weeks later, I received a telephone call. I was hired. A few months passed, and I had forgotten about my promise. Then, one day, while reading the Quran, I came across this verse. Allah will not call you to account for such of your oaths as are vain, but He will call you to account for the oaths which you take in earnest. And do keep your oaths. Thus does Allah explain to you His signs that you may be grateful. That's verse 90 of chapter 5. This verse could have been written for me, he says. I was in the second category and reminded that Allah had fulfilled His part of the bargain. I immediately picked up a telephone book and looked for addresses of Muslim associations. There were a few listed, and I didn't know which one to choose. So I closed my eyes, put my finger down on the page, and picked one at random. I went there many times, but could not find the courage to actually go inside. Finally, after much hesitation, I walked to the door and knocked. My heart was beating very fast. A man opened the door and inquired on the purpose of my visit. I just said that I wanted to become a Muslim. Without a word, he took me to a sitting room, brought me a cup of coffee, and left. A few minutes later, another man entered. He was the president of this community in Holland. I explained again the purpose of my visit, and then he asked me if I had heard of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. I replied in the negative and added that I didn't mind which group it was, I just wanted to become a Muslim. So he started to explain their beliefs. Jesus came back to earth as a new person named Ahmad. The first Jesus didn't die on the cross, but escaped to India. They were persecuted in Pakistan, forbidden by the Saudi government to go to Hajj, and the list went on. I listened to him speechless and bemused. Absolutely nothing of what he said was making any sense. It was like waking up from a bad dream. I went home very confused. I reflected on what happened and concluded that there must have been a purpose to this visit. The most reasonable explanation was that Allah brought me to this sect of lunatics to warn me that the world of Islam was not this ideal image I had. On the other hand, all the prophets have been rejected in the past. Could it be true? In the evening, while preparing some tea on a gas cooker, I remembered the story I'd read in the Quran of Moses and his young companion forgetting their fish, and that this was a sign. I wondered if Allah would also give me a sign. Looking at the stove, I thought that if I forget to turn off the gas, this would be a sign, and I would go back to the mosque and inquire further. That evening, I forgot to turn off the gas 3 times. It had been a very emotional day, so I thought it was probably just a trick of my mind. I implored God to forgive me if I made a mistake and guide me to the right place. I went to bed even more confused, not believing the claim of this community, but with the intention to visit them again as promised. That night, I had a dream. I was in the sitting room of the mosque, and the president of the community walked in. He wore a blue suit, extended his hand, and said, "I congratulate you for your conversion." I also knew from the dream that this would happen within 3 months. I can't really explain how I felt. The dream was so bright and clear, and I had never experienced anything like this. The following morning, I went again to the mosque. I met the missionary, who explained the teaching of Ahmadiyya and gave me a few books. I didn't need much convincing by that time. A few months later, by the grace of Allah, I became an Ahmadi Muslim. The first time I came to attend the Friday prayer, exactly like in my dream, Mr. Hibatul Nur Verhagen, the president of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat in Holland, came to me and told me, "I congratulate you on your conversion." When I look back at all these events, I'm amazed to see that breaking the leg of my friend Said is probably the best thing I've done in my life. And that was the account of Mr. Naveed Ahmed Makhti, which I wanted to read to you in his own words. And as you can see, that's quite a startling example of how God intervened several times in his life to bring him to the truth. Now, there's a third and last incident which I'd like to mention. It's of my cousin Jihan. When she was born, she for some reason they saw that she was she wasn't well. So a scan was done on the newborn baby, and so my uncle was telling me that when they did the scan, they found something which looked very suspiciously like a tumor on one of her kidneys. And the doctors were very, very worried about this, and they said it's very rare for a newborn to have a tumor like this size on a kidney, and it's very, very it seems very dangerous. So he contacted me as well for prayers, and he also sent a fax directly to Hazrat Khalifa Rabi at the time, rahimahullah, the fourth caliph of the community, and asked to pray for her. Now, Hazur received the fax and prayed. And in the meantime, they also decided to offer a goat in sacrifice as a sadaqah, to ward off this evil and pray that Allah may accept it. Another of my uncles, who had been a butcher for around 40 years by that time, was the one who was asked to slaughter the goat that they'd bought. Now, when he slaughtered the goat, when he opened the goat up, to his great surprise, he found a tumor on one of the kidneys of the goat. And he said in 40 years of him slaughtering animals, he had absolutely never seen anything like it. It was the first time ever in his life that he'd seen a tumor on a goat's kidney. Now, after this sacrifice had been made, they brought her back for another scan. And this time, the results were flabbergasting. The tumor had completely disappeared, and the doctors could not understand what had happened. So I actually informed Hazrat Khalifa Rabi rahimahullah of this, and he replied back saying that only Ahmadis can understand what happened here. But this was a sign that Allah gave that their sacrifice had been accepted by showing this sign of the tumor on the sacrificial animal's kidney. And then when they saw that their daughter's scan came back absolutely clear, it was a very, very big sign for them, and a very big sign of Allah's presence, of his existence, and of the fact that he had accepted the prayers of the Khalifa and the prayers of everyone who had prayed, and their sacrifice as well. So these are three instances which I wanted to share with you, just so that you have an idea of how Allah shows his existence by the ways in which he intervenes in the lives of Ahmadi Muslims, how he listens to their prayers, how he accepts their prayers. And there have been tens of thousands of such incidents in our history, and they're still happening. They haven't ended, they're still happening now as I speak. These constitute proof potent that Allah is indeed the living God. And the world would do well to find out about what he wants human beings to do before they inevitably go and meet him after their death. Thank you. So now, if you have any questions, of course, I think we'll be passing over to those.
Murrabi Sahib,
Assalamu
shukriya.
alaikum
Thank you very much.
Sahib.
Assalamu alaikum, Murrabi Sahib. Mashallah, very enlightening lecture. As always, you are, mashallah, one of our very popular speakers, and we have always a lot of love and affection from our viewers. That's also been expressed tonight. So jazakumullah for your precious time as always.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure and honor for me. Thank you.
With your permission, Murrabi Sahib, if I could just put some questions to yourself. We have a question from Rizwan Sheikh Sahib, and his question is, how can we explain God's existence to children?
You see, one thing I've found out during my life is that parents who really want their children to know that God exists are helped to a large degree by Allah Himself. And when they tell their children, when the children, for example, ask them for things or something, and they tell the children, well, pray to Allah, ask Him to kindly grant you that thing. Very often you'll see that Allah makes it happen in ways that make them realize that He exists. I remember, I have personal experiences of this as well of my own children, but I remember one which stands out, which Mirza Safir Ahmed Sahib, who's one of the sons-in-law of Hazrat Murrabi rahimahullah, told me himself. He said that during one of their trips to Europe, they were in a ferry. He said one of his sons at the time, I don't remember exactly which one it was, but he was very little. He was probably 3 or 4. And while they were walking around the ferry, they came across this shop which was selling toys. And he saw a tricycle among several, different types of tricycles and bicycles there for little children, and he really, really wanted to have that one in particular. And Mirza Sahib told me that at that time I didn't actually have the money to buy that for him on me. But I told him, let's go back to our cabin and pray. So they went back to the cabin, they lifted their hands to pray, and they prayed and said, oh Allah, please grant us this thing. And then they said Ameen, and he said, no sooner had we said Ameen than there was a knock on the door, and when we opened the door, it was Hazrat Khalifa Rabi rahimahullah himself, and in his hand was that tricycle, the very one. And Mirza Sahib said, why did you actually choose that one? There were so many different types there. And he said, I don't know, it just came in my heart that I think that your son would have liked this one, so here it is for you. And he'd bought it and brought it along. So he said that became such a big sign for my son. It was like an example of God's existence for him, even at that very young age. So Allah as well is quick to come to your aid as a parent when you sincerely try to impart that knowledge to your children. And He Himself comes with the proof that shake the children up in such a way that they develop a true and sincere belief in God.
Jazakallah, Murrabi Sahib. The next question is, how can we tell if Allah is punishing us or putting us through a test or a trial?
This question has been asked many, many times to the different caliphs, and they've all answered in similar ways. And the basic gist, if you want, of their answer, of their replies is that if it's a trial, then you'll come out of it at the other end as a better person. And you'll then know that this was a trial, and by the grace of Allah, you passed it, flying colors. But if it's a punishment, then you will be in a worse state after you've gone through it or while you're in it. So if you are finding that you're moving away from God and your iman or your faith is weakening, then that is most likely either a sign that you're failing in the test, if it's a test, or it's a punishment of God for whatever reason. But the real thing to look for is that you have to find the courage to go through it, to pass the test with Allah's help. So the true believers always turn to Allah for help at those times. And the disbelievers or weak believers who don't really believe in God, they despair, they lose hope, and they don't turn to God. And some of them actually blame God and say that, why me? Why have you done this to me, etc. So for them, this thing becomes a test, a trial which they fail, or it's a punishment, or it becomes a punishment if they fail it. So this is how we should always try to come out at the other end as better people. Then we have passed the trial in a good way.
And linked to that, Murrabi Sahib, another question that we have is that the problem of suffering, the problem of evil, is usually seen as the biggest challenge to God's existence. What is the best way of addressing this problem, would you say?
Pardon? Could you repeat that question again?
Yeah. So the problem of evil or the problem of suffering is usually seen as the biggest challenge against God's existence by many atheists, for instance. What would you say is the best way of addressing this particular challenge?
I think I touched upon this during the lecture, actually. But you see, the thing is that God doesn't have to intervene in the ways that people think he should. Like Ur said, he's not our slave. He's not at our beck and call. And he does what he wants. But what atheists should think of is that, as I'd said, in a world where there is no God, there should be no intervention at all. There should never be any. And if there was never any intervention, then that would be, quite potent proof of there not being anything there. But as we have seen, there is a lot of intervention going on. God answers our prayers, and he also makes situations change in ways that are quite amazing. And he also shows signs of his existence, sometimes through dreams and revelations, and sometimes by events happening, that are unexpected and against all the odds. So the thing is that even if he intervened only once in a person's life, that should be enough for atheists to realize that since there has been intervention, and we know that this is a highly improbable thing which has happened here. And then when they see that it's happening, to every person on earth, and it does happen, everybody, as Allah says, at least once or twice in their lifetimes, Allah shakes them up. He gives them examples where they can see that he exists and they turn to him, even momentarily. And then later on they forget. Most of the people forget. And the good ones don't forget and build upon that to come closer to him. But the main thing is that even if it happens once or twice, that should be enough for atheists to realize that, okay, he's there. And I should abandon my, petulant demands that he should always be intervening and he shouldn't let anybody ever suffer, and nothing bad, according to the definition of bad, should ever happen. I should let go of that, and I should rather be focusing on what this God is actually asking me to do, because that would be the most important thing. For example, if somebody said, well, I don't believe in tornadoes because tornadoes have to be blue with orange spots. And then there's signs that the tornado is arriving, and it's not blue with orange spots. Now, is the immediate question to say, well, I still don't believe in tornadoes because it's not blue with orange spots, or is it rather to find out what we can do to save ourselves from this tornado, which is evidently coming towards us? So they should, formulate their question in a reasonable fashion for their own security and their own safety, if nothing else. So I think they should be invited to reflect on this and to leave these childish demands. As I said, they're quite petulant demands, which don't amount to anything, and they're only depriving their own selves from something which is vital to their own well-being. So it's a matter of ego, really. Have to let go of their ego and their own made-up conditions and ideas and get real, as they say.
The next question is from Muzaffar Hussain Sahib. His question is, can we establish God's existence through scientific evidence?
Like I said, it's interesting to be able to do so, and we can, of course, do that, but it doesn't go all the way. Scientific evidence points to the fact that there must have been some creator who did it all, but maybe he's no longer in the picture now, Maybe he's just quietly moved away, or he's died, as the Prophet himself has said. Maybe he's died and not here anymore. Maybe he set everything in motion and then he just disappeared. So the most important thing is to show people that he is alive and he is here. That's the most important thing. Secondary to that is to find signs of his existence in his own creation. Now, some of the examples I gave, one is, for example, the instruction manual found in DNA. I mean, people don't reflect on this enough. These are just some molecules. They're lifeless molecules, but they contain the blueprint on how an organism is going to be built, how it's going to function, how it's going to feed itself, how it's going to defend itself. What are its specificities. All these things are encapsulated in that tiny, tiny little part of the cell within DNA. And this is meaningful information, which is also functional because it can play out according to the manual, to the guidelines set within it. And people don't realize that this kind of information can't come from chaos. It has to come from an intelligent mind. I mean, that's the only logical way to see it. So there has to be some kind of intelligence. And I know Dawkins, for example, because he really, really doesn't want to admit to the existence of God. But he's gone, the furthest he's ever gone is that, look, because there's evidence of intelligent design, I'd be prepared to go as far as to say, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, of course, that some very, very highly intelligent and highly developed extraterrestrials may have started the process, launched the process of life on Earth. And then through natural selection, etc., all these different forms of life appeared. So that's as far as I'd be willing to go to admit, that if there is intelligence, then it must come from there. But then the question, of course, is he's just pushing the goalpost a little further. But then who made those extraterrestrials? Was it even more advanced extraterrestrials who made them, etc., etc.? So he didn't really answer the question. But it just shows, a lack of goodwill the stubbornness to refuse the idea that there could be an intelligence outside the material world, and rather try to answer the question by appealing to some more, other forms of material life elsewhere in the universe. So that's a little bit disingenuous. But there you go. There you have it.
Jazakallah, Murrabi Sahib. Again, just a couple more questions with your permission, Murrabi Sahib. And again, I think you've touched upon some of these areas already, but maybe it's a chance just to elaborate on some of these aspects. So we know that there's obviously various data that comes out from time to time that suggests that unbelief or atheism is on the rise. And you've cited people like Richard Dawkins who have a huge influence in that sort of in that mindset that we're seeing an increasing rise in. What would you say is the best way to address the threat, as it were, of atheism?
Well, as far as we're concerned ourselves, as Ur has repeatedly said to us on many occasions, we should reinforce our knowledge of God, our knowledge of our religion, what our religion teaches, and what the history of our religion is. Because the history comprises all these instances, these incidents, these elements that I'd been mentioning earlier on. And we should acquaint ourselves with these so that we can protect ourselves and our children from the onslaught of materialism. Because in fact, the atheism that you see today is linked to stark materialism. It's born out of it. People are told, that you only have one life, the life on Earth, and you have to make the best of it. You have to be, you can do anything you like, you can be anything you'd like to be, and all those kind of, refrains that we hear, especially in schools. I mean, I don't need to tell you, you're probably well aware of that as a teacher yourself. But the thing is that we need to know ourselves, and we need to teach our children about these things so that they know that God actually exists. And we need to strengthen our relationship with God. And Huzur has been saying this all the time. I mean, this is his message to the Jamaat, first of all, but to the world in general. You must strengthen your relationship with God. And the only way to do that is to pray to him, to develop a living relationship with him, to do what he says, to give him his what's due to him, and to give to other creatures their rights. So if we do that, then God will start manifesting himself in our lives much more than when we are further away from him. And that in turn will reinforce our certainty in his existence. And nothing will be able to sway us after that, towards atheism. I mean, atheism just doesn't make sense when these things are happening. How can we say, when all these things are happening again and again in front of our very eyes, in our own lives, in the lives of our friends and people around us, that, well, no matter what, God doesn't exist? I mean, this just doesn't make any sense. So the sensible thing to do is to realize that he's there, and to do that, you have to do the things which I just mentioned.
Absolutely. And Rabbi, we know this is the last question. We know that, mashallah, you're very much involved and also very interested in the work of rational religion, who are at the forefront, I think we will all say, in responding to and refuting a lot of the criticisms and allegations made against religion or theism. Are you just able to give us a bit more insight into rational religion as a setup, its aims and objectives, and why you think it's important for us to make use of these excellent resources that are being produced?
Well, thank you very much indeed for giving us the opportunity to speak about rational religion. Rational religion is a website, and it has a YouTube channel, it has a Twitter account, etc., etc. On different social media platforms. It's present. And the aim of it is to address atheism in the modern age, to address the arguments of atheism, the best arguments of atheism. We've discovered that all the arguments actually which are presented today are very old arguments. They're just rehashed and presented, with modern wrapping. But they're all the age-old arguments. It gets a bit boring because we'd like them to come up with something new every so often, but it doesn't happen, unfortunately. So these are addressed, and thank you very much for putting up the link on the screen. So this is one aspect, but the other aspect is to tell them that not only are you're wrong in your assumptions about God and about religion, but here is a religion, the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam, which is presenting the pristine teachings of Islam, which enable a person to get in direct communion with God, and which will bring a person into a relationship with God, where God will be responding to prayers, will be showing signs, and it's something wonderful. And it's all very rational. I mean, that's the name of it, rational religion. And we show that by delving deep into modern science as well, to show that the Quran and Islam, the message of Islam, is aligned with what is known to be correct science. Science is of course an evolving thing, and what could be a paradigm today might be rejected tomorrow. But there are certain truths which are unchanging and which are well founded, and so those principles or those facts, those truths, are in accordance with what the Quran says and with what Islam says. So these are the different aims, and it's to bring atheists to God, basically. But it's also to help our youth who may be a little bit overawed by the brilliance and the spectacle put up by science these days and of technology, into thinking that we don't have all that, and so therefore maybe we're on the wrong path and God doesn't really exist. It's absolutely the contrary. So we give them hope as well, and we give them not just hope, but we give them certainty in the fact that all these things actually come from God himself, and that there is no contradiction between his word and his work. So a lot of young people appreciate what we're doing, and they say that that it's opened their eyes and they didn't know all these things. And I have to admit that a lot of the things which are being put forward by the Nasser brothers in particular, and those who are helping them as well, are new to me as well. I mean, they're discovering so many amazing things, in the Quran and in Islam, and it's really, really exciting as a journey to, as we're moving forward in time, how many things are being thrown up. So hopefully a lot of atheists will find answers there, and that will help them in the quest to see whether God exists or not.
No, very much so. And obviously the link is there for everyone to take a look. I think a lot of our members are very familiar with excellent work that goes on, and mashallah, Murrabi Sahib, being humble as you are, I think it's not always recognized the huge amount of influence and sway that you have in that particular initiative. And also as a teacher myself, I have used their excellent resources in my lessons about religion, and they do give a fresh perspective to students, and they do look at religion in a new light, in a very positive light. So I'd obviously highly recommend and encourage our members to make full use of the excellent resources, as videos, articles, discussion programs, which are really useful to make use of. So please do make use of that excellent resource that we have within our Jamaat. Murrabi Sahib, mashallah, we've received some very positive, glowing comments as expected from our viewers. And inshallah, we'd love to have you on again very soon. One of our many popular speakers, mashallah. And may Allah bless you for your precious time and advice and guidance this evening.
Thank you very much. And it was also always a great honor for me. It's a very humbling experience, and I feel very honored. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, the honor is ours. Jazakallah. So just a reminder to our viewers that our lectures return next week. As always, our Urdu lectures are on Monday evenings, and our English lectures will be on Tuesday evenings. As you can see, tonight was our, mashallah, 151st lecture since we began at the start of lockdown last year. And we are very much keen and committed to carrying on with these lectures. We're also very keen to hear from you as viewers of your own suggestions, recommendations of topics that you'd like covered as well. So please do get in touch with us through our email address and also our social media channels. If I could please request our respected speaker tonight, Maulana Abdul Ghany Jahangeer Khan Sahib, to lead us in a silent prayer.
Please join me in silent prayer. Allahumma ameen, thumma ameen. Jazakumullah sunnah jaza.
Jazakumullah sunnah jaza. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.